It began with a sound. Not a scream. Not the usual noise of an old house settling into the night. This was a deep, rhythmic thump that seemed to echo from the walls themselves. Neighbors on the quiet Alabama street, where Wilson Pickett once lived, swore they'd heard it too. Like a bass line, steady as a heartbeat. One woman told a local paper. It always came just after midnight, the hour most associated with Pickett's greatest hit. In the midnight hour, when the new owners moved in, an ordinary couple with no connection to music, they brushed it off as coincidence. But on their very first week, the thumping woke them both, rattling picture frames along the hallway. At first they suspected the air conditioning unit, then the pipes, then even stray wildlife in the attic. But inspections showed nothing. No mechanical fault, no signs of animals. The sounds, as strange as they were, seemed to follow a pattern, always beginning around 12:05 a.m., fading by 1 o'clock, then vanishing completely until the next night. The neighbors were quick to connect it to the house's history. This was where Wilson Pickett had lived his final years, a place where visitors recalled late-night rehearsals and recordings spilling into the early morning hours. One man, who'd lived across the street since the 1980s, claimed he could still see shadows through the window panes, figures moving as though someone were pacing with restless energy, even when the lights were off. The new owners decided to test it. They set up a simple digital recorder in the living room, leaving it running from midnight until morning. The following day, they listened back. First, only silence. Then, faint but unmistakable, the sound of feet shuffling across hardwood, followed by that same low thumping, almost musical in its rhythm. A skeptical friend suggested it could be an echo of traffic or vibrations from distant trains. But the house wasn't near any tracks, and the sounds always began at precisely the same time. Instead of fear, a kind of uneasy curiosity grew. What could be measured, what could be explained, and what perhaps was simply the weight of memory pressed into the walls of a place once alive with music. The couple began to take notes, treating their nights in the house like an ongoing experiment. Each evening, they jotted down the exact time they went to bed, when the noises started, how long they lasted, and what details stood out. It quickly became obvious that this was no random occurrence. The disturbances were almost painfully precise. At 5 minutes past midnight, the first sound always arrived. Sometimes it was that heavy, rhythmic thump, like a foot pressing insistently into a wooden floor. Other times it began with a shuffle, almost like someone turning in place, shifting their weight before the beat began. What unnerved them most was not just the predictability, but the fact that the noises seemed to come from inside the house rather than from outside. They walked the rooms at night with flashlights, trying to catch the moment when the sound began, but each time it seemed to move just ahead of them. In the living room, it would echo as if someone were pacing slowly, the rhythm reverberating through the boards. In the kitchen, it was more muffled, like the sound was pressing through the walls. Upstairs, near the bedrooms, it sometimes carried a strange, almost hollow resonance, as though the floor itself were acting as an instrument. The neighbors were divided. Some dismissed it outright. Old houses do that, one man insisted, pointing out how the Alabama humidity could make wood expand and contract. But others weren't so quick to brush it aside. An older woman, who had known Wilson Pickett personally in his later years, told the couple that he was often restless at night. He wasn't the kind to sleep easy, she said. Even when he wasn't recording, he'd get up, pace around, hum, stomp his foot, sing under his breath. It was like music never left him, even in silence. The couple started noticing other details. When they left items on the coffee table overnight, they would sometimes be nudged ever so slightly by morning keys slid a few inches, a remote turned on its side, a glass coaster left at an angle. Nothing dramatic, nothing that couldn't be explained by their own forgetfulness. But as the nights went on, the pattern of small disturbances grew harder to ignore. Once, they set a metronome in the living room half as a joke. At precisely 12:05, it began to tick on its own, its pendulum swinging in perfect time with the thumping they heard. The husband swore he had left it wound down, incapable of moving. His wife said nothing, but the look on her face carried more weight than any denial. The recordings became a kind of obsession. They played them back at breakfast, pausing and rewinding over certain moments. On one tape, they caught what sounded almost like a voice, muffled, strained, but undeniably human. Just 3 words, barely audible: midnight hour. A friend with some experience in sound engineering insisted it was interference, maybe a bleed from a distant radio signal, but the couple knew how perfectly it fit the timing. It was too neat, too coincidental. And then there was the night when the husband woke to find himself humming. Not just humming, but actually mouthing the words of a song he hadn't consciously thought of in years. He nudged his wife awake, asking if she heard it. She nodded, half asleep, and whispered, "It's in the midnight hour." They sat in the dark, listening, unsure if the melody was truly in the air, or if it had somehow seeped into their thoughts. By the end of their second month in the house, they had gathered enough material to fill a binder. Audio clips, handwritten notes, times, dates, even sketches of where they thought the sounds originated. They weren't sensationalists, not the type to make wild claims. But they couldn't deny that something, whatever it was, had embedded itself into the walls. They invited a local historian to walk through the property, hoping for context. He explained that Wilson Pickett's later years had been spent quietly, mostly away from the spotlight, but music had never left him. Old session musicians recalled late-night gatherings, where Pickett would slam his foot on the ground to set the tempo, forcing everyone to fall in line with his beat. That was his way of commanding the room, the historian said. He didn't just sing in the midnight hour, he lived it. Midnight was when he felt alive. The words sank into the couple as they stood in their dim living room. Midnight was no longer just a time of day in this house, it was a ritual, a cycle repeating itself over and over. And though no neighbor, historian, or friend could provide an absolute explanation, the evidence they collected only deepened the tension. What remained was a question they didn't dare speak aloud. If the music hadn't truly ended, what would it take to quiet it? Or, perhaps more unsettling, should it even be quieted at all? Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The couple soon realized that their nightly observations were becoming less about curiosity and more about survival. Sleep came in short bursts, broken by the familiar thumping and the strange, low hum that seemed to bleed from the walls. They tried earplugs, white noise machines, even sleeping in separate rooms to test whether the sounds were subjective or shared. No matter where they rested, no matter how they blocked their ears, the noises arrived like clockwork, beginning with that soft shuffle at 12:05 a.m. and building into something almost like a rehearsal: footsteps, taps, and sometimes what could only be described as fragments of a song carried on the air. The strangest moments came when other people were present. One evening, they invited a neighbor couple over for dinner. They spoke of the house cautiously, testing the waters to see if outsiders would notice anything. At first, their guests laughed off the stories, convinced it was just old floorboards or the tricks of imagination. But when the clock passed midnight, the atmosphere changed. The rhythmic pounding began, faint at first, then stronger, vibrating through the hardwood beneath their feet. The neighbors froze mid-conversation, exchanging uncertain glances. The husband excused himself to check the front porch, certain it must be some prankster outside, but found nothing. The air was still, the street completely quiet. When he returned, the sound was louder inside the house than ever. The visitors left quickly after that night, their faces pale, and never again accepted an invitation. Alone again, the couple pressed further into their experiments. They purchased motion-activated cameras and set them at key points in the house: the living room, the stairwell, the upstairs landing. Reviewing the footage was both dull and unsettling. Hours of silence followed by moments where the microphones picked up vibrations, but the video showed nothing unusual. Except, on one recording, a faint blur appeared in the living room mirror. Not a figure exactly, but a distortion, as if the glass itself rippled at the exact moment the first thump began. This discovery rattled them more than they wanted to admit. Mirrors, after all, had long been tied to superstition, and Wilson Pickett had been known for performing in front of large mirrored panels in his rehearsal spaces, watching his movements as closely as his voice. Was it possible the house had absorbed more than just his sound? The wife began covering mirrors at night with sheets, but the husband insisted on leaving them uncovered to test whether the distortion would appear again. Their quiet disagreement about it added another layer of tension, the house not only disrupting their sleep, but slowly chipping at their trust in each other's perceptions. By the third month, the disturbances took on a more intimate form. The wife began waking at odd hours, not to sounds in the distance, but to the distinct sensation of movement beside her bed. The first time, she thought her husband had gotten up to walk around, but when she reached out, he was still there, sound asleep. Another night, she swore she felt a hand press lightly against her shoulder, steady and deliberate, yet when she turned there was no one. She refused to speak of it in detail at first, afraid that even naming the experience might solidify it, might give it more power. But the exhaustion wore her down, and she eventually confessed. The husband tried to stay rational. He kept meticulous notes, mapped the times and places of every sound, and compared them to environmental factors: humidity, outside temperature, even the timing of neighborhood traffic. Nothing matched. The disturbances remained uncomfortably consistent. Worse, they seemed to intensify whenever someone dismissed them. One night, after he muttered aloud that it was all in their heads, the pounding grew so strong it rattled dishes in the kitchen cupboards, sending one plate sliding forward and shattering on the floor. It was the historian who suggested a possible link they hadn't considered. In an interview at a local library, he told them that Pickett often spoke about rhythm not as something external, but as something alive, like a pulse that lived in his body and carried into everything around him. He used to say he could feel the beat in the floorboards, the historian recalled, like the house itself was keeping time with him. The couple exchanged uneasy glances. Their own floorboards were now doing exactly that, keeping time long after the man who gave them rhythm had passed. Word of their experiences spread quietly through the neighborhood. A few locals dropped hints that others had heard unusual things near the house long before the new owners moved in, but most avoided the topic, unwilling to be associated with ghost stories. Yet there was one retired musician, a man who had briefly toured with Pickett, who came forward. He stood in their living room, listening carefully as midnight approached, and when the familiar thumping began, he only nodded. "That's him," he said softly. That's exactly how he'd start a session. A foot on the floor, steady and hard, until everyone fell in line. He's still keeping time. The couple could no longer ignore the question that hung over every night. Was this simply the echo of a man whose presence was burned into the walls, or was something still moving through the house, refusing to let go of its midnight ritual? The evidence they had gathered seemed to push them closer to an answer, but none of it could explain why the sounds had grown stronger, or why on more than one occasion they now found themselves waking not to noises, but to their own voices whispering lyrics they had never meant to speak. The decision to confront the mystery came on a night when the couple could no longer pretend it was just noise. They had endured months of rhythmic pounding, muffled voices, and unexplained disturbances. But it was the night when the wife woke to hear her husband singing in his sleep, his voice carrying the words, in the midnight hour, with eerie precision that convinced them the time had come. His eyes were closed, his body still, but the voice that came from him was not his own. She shook him awake, and when he opened his eyes, he had no memory of singing at all. They decided to set one final test. If the sound was tied to music, they would answer it with music. At 11:50 p.m., they placed a record player in the living room, the old turntable borrowed from a neighbor. On the platter they laid one of Pickett's albums, worn with age. They set microphones around the house, cameras facing mirrors, even a notepad on the coffee table with a pen, as if inviting whatever was there to leave its mark. When the clock struck midnight, they pressed the needle down. The room filled with the raw, brassy sound of Wilson Pickett's voice, his trademark growl riding over the horns. For the first time in months, there was no pounding, no shuffling, no whispering, only the record spinning, alive with energy. They exchanged a look: relief at first, then dread. Because when the song ended, the silence that followed was thicker than any before. And at exactly 12:05, the house responded. The thump came once so strong the record player vibrated. The needle skipped, cutting the sound. Then again, louder, echoing through the walls like a command. The lights flickered. The pen on the coffee table rolled across the paper, as if nudged by a firm but invisible hand. The husband lunged forward and turned the record back on, forcing the song to play. The pounding stopped instantly, replaced by a stillness that was almost reverent, as though the house itself were listening. It was then that the wife noticed movement in the mirror above the fireplace. Not a blur this time, but a clear distortion of light, a shimmer that formed the vague shape of a man leaning forward, head bowed. She held her breath, afraid that speaking would scatter it. The husband, unaware, adjusted the record player, letting the track repeat. Each time the voice of Pickett rose, the shimmering form steadied. When the track ended, the form flickered, unstable, and the pounding returned. By instinct more than reason, the wife whispered, "Stay." The pounding paused, just for a second, as though the house were listening. They played the record again and again until the grooves wore thin. Each time the disturbances eased. It was only when the turntable finally broke down weeks later that the pattern changed. Without the record, the nightly pounding no longer began at 12:05. It became erratic, sometimes beginning earlier, sometimes later, and often accompanied by faint murmurs, too soft to make out but steady enough to be unsettling. Desperate, they sought out a sound engineer to analyze the recordings they'd collected. He brought advanced software, isolating frequencies, removing background noise. After hours of work, he called them to the screen. The spectrogram of one midnight recording showed not just noise, but something close to words. Stretched and distorted, but undeniably there, "I'm still here." The couple sat in silence, staring at the screen. Rational explanations struggled to make sense. Was it a misinterpretation of random noise? A trick of software? Or was it something more? A message layered into the vibrations of the house? They moved out not long after. Sleeplessness, the strain of living in constant unease, and the toll on their marriage proved too much. They left behind their binders of notes, their audio clips, even the broken turntable unable to carry the weight of it with them. The house, once filled with Wilson Pickett's late-night rehearsals, stood quiet for a few months before another family moved in. But the neighbors swear the pattern continues. The new occupants rarely speak of it, but several have been seen outside at night, standing in the driveway, listening with nervous expressions toward the house. One teenager confided to a friend at school that his father sometimes wakes at midnight, pacing the halls without remembering it the next day. Another neighbor, walking his dog, claimed he heard music one night, faint, but unmistakable, the raspy voice of "In the Midnight Hour" drifting through the windows long after the record player was gone. The story lingers because it is neither fully explainable nor completely deniable. The thumping, the whispers, the recordings, the shimmering in the mirrors, none of it has been disproven, and none of it has been resolved. Perhaps it is simply the echo of a man who lived for rhythm, whose life was bound to the pulse of midnight. Or perhaps, as some quietly suggest, Wilson Pickett himself never truly left the house at all. And so, on that quiet Alabama street, neighbors still pause when the clock strikes 12, waiting to see if the rhythm will begin again, steady, insistent, impossible to ignore. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.